All right, so reminders. Um, the first mini project implementing a sort of very basic genetic algorithm on a simple numerical optimization problem due Sunday. And so that's the only mini project that can't be dropped. There's Muddy's Point, as usual, due Sunday. The next concept check is due a week from Sunday. So not this week, but the next one. So it'll be on this sort of adaptive immune system stuff that we're going to be starting out here in this unit. But from and then so there, frequently asked questions about this mini project. Um, I'm expecting very simple implementations. So these are not going to be modular implementations. They're not going to have ways, I mean, they can, but they don't need to have ways to plug in new selection operators or anything like that. You're just going to make a couple of choices and hard code those choices into your algorithm. Uh, I don't want you to use any off-the-shelf API for existing genetic algorithms. So I don't want you to use in MATLAB the GA tool, or in Python, PyGAD, or some of these other ones that already exist. But if you want to make use of some convenient data structure that is generic, is unrelated to the GA, you don't have to implement that yourself, then feel free to use that. So you can feel free to use other tools, but I just want to see the salient features of the GA in coded up from scratch, so that you have an ability to play with those things to kind of see, well, this is what happens when I make these choices about mutation, these choices about selection, and so on. And yeah, so any questions about that? And this is the only mini project where I give you kind of an outline of specific questions I'm looking for, so specific tasks. From here on out, the other 2 or 3 mini projects that you'll choose throughout the semester to do will be more open-ended. So we'll say, well, we'll learn about, some simulated annealing, or some multi-objective approach, or ant colony optimization, or something like that. And in which case you'd say, well, that was interesting to me. I am going to try to implement that myself and and demonstrate some property of it. So when I set the pheromone trail characteristics for ant colony optimization a certain way, then I'm unable to find certain types of optimization optimal points. But when I set them another way, and then it restores that. So it shows, demonstrates that feature of it, something along those lines. But it'll be much more kind of open-ended, just demonstrating that you had the ability to implement and then demonstrate some level of understanding of that. And so it's just giving you a chance to practice these things and get a little more in depth than just the discussions we have. All right, so we left off last time finishing up the genetic algorithm, and the one thing that we didn't talk about, get into detail, were all of the mutation operators. And so the basic, mutation operators are, these are just things that are, in each one of them, there's going to be some probability of mutating each gene in an individual. But then how you do that mutation varies. So if you decide, so in so-called uniform mutation, the simplest way to implement that is to just draw uniformly from all possible alleles for that gene. So draw uniformly from all possible alleles. And so that might be that for individual X, for individual J at gene I, then the next gene, if it's been selected for mutation, is just going to be drawn from, in the case of it's a real valued gene, then maybe there's a lower bound and an upper bound, and we're just going to draw uniformly from that. And so it doesn't matter what the previous allele was, it gets blown away completely and just replaced with a random allele from the feasible set in that dimension. Alternatively, it's common to, instead of blow the whole thing away, just add noise that is uncorrelated the with the step, the current step of the generation, and uncorrelated with the current value. So sort of zero mean noise you can just add on top of it. So, so alternative is just add noise with a consistent variance, and then typically zero mean. So examples of that might be that individual J at gene I, maybe their next value. So I'll just make prime as their next one. So maybe I'll do prime up here. It's just a convention for the next one. Is just going to be the previous version, individual J gene I, plus some uniform noise with some width. So this is just zero mean, zero mean in between minus W and W, where W is a hyperparameter that you could set. Alternatively, it doesn't have to be uniform. You could instead say that maybe xj I prime is xj I plus a, say, draw from a normal distribution with zero mean and some variance that you specify, where this is another hyperparameter. And in these cases, you might have to check for feasibility so they don't go out of bounds. But that would be kind of the simple way to implement mutation at these individual genes. Now, the problem with this is that you might want to do coarse grain search. So really, that's what mutation gives you. It adds a lot of diversity to your system. So initially, you have an initial population that has a lot of diversity just built into the population. But then in order for them to move anywhere, the mutation is really one of the key ways that in order to do that. And so initially at the start of your algorithm, you probably placed those population members, in places that weren't necessarily great relative to that fitness objective. They were just randomly placed there. And so you want to give them the opportunity to move around. And so maybe at the beginning of your algorithm, you want a large variance in your mutation steps, a large step size. But maybe as the algorithm goes on, you assume that they're going to find regions of high fitness, and then you don't want them to kind of hang around there and fine tune. So if you have the same high step size, the same large variance here, then even if they find a good place of your fitness landscape, they might then move away from it, and you're constantly going to be battling them, trying to get them back, because they're just always, there's very frequently you're drawing values that are far away. So that's why you've got these non-uniform mutation gives you an option there where we scale step size over time. And so in non-uniform mutation, you might do something like the next value of the gene is going to be the previous value plus, and I'll say there's some maximum displacement, which I'll call just a hyperparameter, D naught, which will then get scaled by T. That'll be maybe, if let's say I have termination conditions and I'm going to run my genetic algorithm until I reach T time steps or T generations. So then I might say T minus little t, where little t is my current generation, over big T. And so this is like the at the start of my GA, this will be 1 because I'll be at generation 0. So I go to the maximum step size. But then once I hit my termination generation, T, then this will go down to 0, and then I won't have any movement. And then this will then get multiplied by a uniform random variable. So I'm abusing notation a little bit here, but that says distributed between -1 and 1. And so here I'll just write that T is max generations and little t is current generation index. And little t is between, let's say, 0 and big T. This is a reminder. So that allows us to start with big steps and then over time take finer grain steps. And when we get into simulated annealing, which is a very successful optimization approach that is not related to biological systems, but is inspired by physical systems, then it has a very similar temperature parameter where you start out and things are very hot and things are moving around a lot, and then they cool down over time and then they move around less and less and less. And that's kind of what this is capturing here. So those are your three, basic ways you can implement mutation. And you could imagine more ways to do this. And that's going to get into this next unit as we talk about, these alternatives to genetic algorithms, and that were similarly inspired by natural systems, but they elaborate more in these kind of mutation steps, and they get closer to something you'd see in a typical machine learning class, where the mutation starts actually being like a sampling distribution, where you can imagine that in certain dimensions, like right now, these parameters I have not made specific to the gene locations. But why should I mutate one gene the same as another? They might have completely different units. So you might imagine that some genes I'll have, and some genes just might contribute more to fitness than others. So you might imagine that once I hit a certain gene, that a certain allele along a certain gene, that I'm not really getting a whole lot of fitness benefit by changing. Maybe I settle that one down. But then there's another one where it seems like there's a lot of innovation here, because as I change that gene, then my fitness changes a whole lot and seems to be changing for the better. So I might want to, increase my mutation for one gene, but decrease it for another gene. And that's the so-called evolution strategies allows you to do that, which is what we'll talk about today. But this basic idea is we're hitting all genes with the same mutation, but that mutation might change over time. So you could imagine further ways to elaborate this. That's all I'm trying to get at. So any questions about these basic ideas behind mutation operations you can add to the genetic algorithm? Uniform, non-uniform. Non-uniform just because it's changing over time. Okay, great. So that's mutation, and that's basically the end of our kind of exploration of the GA. So as we've seen, there are a lot of hyperparameters. So there's hyperparameters like um, how big your population is, how likely you are to crossover, what your mutation rate is. There are hyperparameters that of particular operators. So you select a certain operator and they might have further parameterization. So for example, if you were to choose ranking selection, how many kind of points you give to each ranking, the benefit of being higher ranked, that tunes selective pressure. In tournament selection, how big your tournaments are, that tunes selective pressure. In fitness proportionate selection, how you choose to do your scaling, that changes selective pressure. So there's a number of different hyperparameters which you can pick. Oh, and of course, like number of elites, that also is another thing there. And so it seems a little daunting. And so, but you sort of try to build a conceptual framework where you try to say, well, why am I increasing this hyperparameter over another? Or what would be the advantage here? And you try to use pilot runs of the optimization algorithm to kind of give you an idea of what sort of environment you're sitting in with that fitness objective. And that might tell you that, okay, for this particular fitness objective, I just need to do a lot of fine tuning. And the only way I can do fine tuning is by having a giant population. So, if I look at this weird diagram here, as you increase that population size, this area where drift dominates, where you get no fitness feedback, where everything's just random chance, as you increase your population size, that will decrease the size of this region so that you mainly stick over here where you've got exploration and exploitation. And so if you want to be in the fine tuning region, then you want to be sure that you can spend some time down here. Well, mutation is going to continually keep perturbing you. And so if you have a high mutation parameter, then you're not going to be able to fine tune. It's going to be keep kicking you up here into exploration. So if you set your mutation low, then and if you have a high population size, that's going to shrink this region, and a low mutation rate, that's going to put you over here, which is great if you have initial conditions that you just want to fine tune, but it's not going to go very far from those initial conditions. If you are not sure where the optimum is, and so your initial conditions are total random guesses, you probably need some amount of mutation to move you around. So that'll put you kind of up here. But the more mutation, the less likely you are to actually make it into this region down here. Because remember that drift and natural selection are constantly pulling you down this way. Because eventually the GA is going to purge all of the diversity from itself. It naturally sort of turns itself off. Mutation is kind of a starter motor that's going to keep trying to restart the GA, but if your mutation's not that strong, then you're just going to kind of deviate around wherever things settle down to. So, that's kind of the picture that I want you to kind of have here is you're constantly fighting against diversity being purged from your system, and you're trying to come up with clever choices of hyperparameters and structures of operators to manage that constant vacuum of diversity out of your system, while also trying to not just flood your system with pure mutation, which prevents you from really homing in on a really good solution that is slightly different from other solutions. That's the general idea here. There are lots of extensions. I've kind of hinted at some of them. These hyperparameters can be dynamic. We saw the mutation rate can change over time. You can also change how likely crossover is over time. For example, there are ways, as we'll see with evolution strategies, to change the rate, to change the population size over time. It's a little hard to see how to do that in a GA, but if we think about this process a little bit more statistically, then it becomes more obvious how we can have variable population sizes. There's things that restrict crossover between compatible species. One of the if you have a candidate solution that is very, very different from another candidate solution, like it has a totally different set of genes, then if both candidate solutions have okay fitness, swapping half of the genes may not be a great idea because it's like they kind of work with a totally different theory of operation. This one's got wings, this one's got wheels. They both are getting from point A to point B, but there's going to be a bunch of secondary adaptations that facilitate wheeled life that are very different than those secondary adaptations that facilitate winged life. So your drone over here that's flying around might need a different set of parameters than your ground vehicle over here. And doing a crossover between those two is not going to produce a better vehicle. It's probably going to produce something that's got one wheel and one wing, and it's not going to fly. So in that particular case, you might want to say that I only allow crossover between solutions that are sufficiently similar to each other. So then you have to define some notion of similarity, some notion of genotypic similarity. Do I need to create sort of subspecies or species inside my genetic algorithm where I only get mating within the species? So that way I've got species that compete with each other for access to the community, but they only recombine within their own species. That's another extension of the GA. And then, generally speaking, operators that are sensitive to diversity. So not just for that problem, but you might just notice that my whole population looks very similar to itself. Maybe in this particular case, I'm going to crank up mutation rate just for a little bit, just to spread everybody out. It's like a restart. And then I get new initial conditions, and then I bring my mutation rate back down. So these are all ways that you can elaborate the GA that people have done, and then you can, and then that, and you know, companies like MathWorks have created parameterizable GAs that allow you to play with this yourself. They set a kind of a stock version that doesn't do too many crazy things, but then gives you the opportunity to go in and tune those. All right, so that's our GA wrap. So any questions about the GA? Okay. All right. Well, so the GA, that was kind of our first introduction to evolutionary computing. And so evolutionary computing is something that really goes back as far as, Alan Turing in the 50s. The general idea that people were motivated that you look out at nature, nature seems to be doing something computation-like. We could use computational principles to model nature, and maybe nature could provide us new insights in how to do computation. And so we've talked about that, one of the, that kind of bubbled up, and then in a bunch of the strategies that basically the three big strategies that we'll talk about here, that we started talking about with the GA, all started in the 70s, really, and have been elaborated significantly since then. So we mentioned in the GA, and that was due to somebody named John Holland. I mean, it's due to a lot of these are due to a lot of people, but Holland is one of the ones who's really associated with the GA. And Holland he was a computer scientist. He was a lot of things. He's an interdisciplinary thinker. He's a complex systems person. I would not say that Holland was primarily motivated, from my read of Holland, by optimization. I think Holland was really interested in saying, understanding nature. And he wanted the GA to be a computational tool for him to think about why nature works. And he had a restricted version of the GA, simpler than the GA that we've been talking about, that allowed him to define, he had this so-called schema theorem, where if you had if you had a genetic algorithm that had like binary genes and that had a bunch of these restrictions, but it operated very similar to the GA that we talked about here, then you could actually write proofs about the cases where the GA was guaranteed to reach kind of optimal fitness. And he thought that that was very illustrative and interesting, that to be able to write these proofs and to understand like what are the essence of what's going on with evolution via genetics. And so that was kind of Holland and the GA. But around the same time, across the Atlantic, there was another set of strategies that were being developed independently, called evolution strategies, which have been pretty influential in machine learning um, since then. And so evolution strategies, there are people like Ingo Reckenberg, for example, Hans Paul Scheffel, that were in that first developed these. This you can view, again, they were developed independently, but so don't think of them when I say they're an alternative. It's not like they were meant to be an alternative. They were just sort of a different way of coming at it. And I would say that the people that came up with evolution strategies did have optimization in mind. They were not interested in modeling nature, but more saying, hey, there's something interesting going on in nature. Let's try to come up with practical ways to solve optimization problems, and particularly numerical optimization problems with real valued decision vectors or decision variables. And so, they're, so it's an alternative form of evolutionary algorithm. They've got, one of the interesting features is that mutation rate is multidimensional, and possibly in some versions, a part of the chromosome. So they did have an idea of a decision vector, which would be all of your decision variables. Like, so how many wheels does my robot have? What material they made out of, those sorts of things. All that would be part of your decision vector. But then they might, on top of that, say this individual um, has mutation rates for each one of those decision variables, and it can vary not only per across the decision variables, but across individuals. So I might have a mutation rate for number of wheels on my ground robot, and that mutation rate is going to vary from another individual. So not only do I have a different number of wheels, but my tendency to produce offspring with a different number of wheels than me is itself going to differ from another individual whose mutation rate. So this individual over here has 4 wheels, and his offspring has 4 wheels, and his offspring has 4 wheels, and so on. This individual over here, she has, 6 wheels, but her offspring are likely to have anywhere from 4 to 8 wheels, and their offspring are likely to have anywhere from 2 to 40 wheels. And as you're figuring out the right number of wheels, you're also figuring out the right mutation rate. So it allows mutation to vary in a much more kind of interesting way that allows for more dynamic searches that in some ways can be faster, because you can get some individuals can be fine tuning while other individuals are really searching the space. So it's just sort of a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. And also here, crossover is usually implemented with, and I'll give examples of this, and then I'll give a specific example that you'll see in modern day times and a lot of tools with convex combinations. So weighted combinations. So in the GA, it was, crossover was, it was very sort of physical. We line up a chromosome, we line up another chromosome, we pick a spot, we line up a genotype, another genotype, we pick a spot, we swap, and that's crossover. But I said you can do crossover arithmetically, mathematically. You can just say, I'm going to have one offspring as a mixture of the genes from one variable or from one parent and another parent. So it's 75% parent A, 25% parent B. That is the predominant way to do crossover in evolution strategies, is that you have a bunch of parents and you cross over from them. And in evolution strategies, you don't have to have just 2 parents. If you can take a weighted combination of parents, so if I'm going to say an offspring is 75% mom and 25% dad, well, that's a pretty easy mathematical operation for me to define for 6 parents. I can say it's 10% this one, 20% this one, and so on and so forth. So you can mix across more than just 2 parents in order to create offspring. And so that's another thing that you see vary across evolution strategies. So just a very different way of thinking of it. The notation that we're going to see in evolution strategies will take 2 forms. So I'm going to just use variables similar to what we've been talking about, like the comma and the plus form here. So if you say an evolution strategy is R comma M, what you're saying is that you're going to have a population size of M, but the next generation is going to be formed through the contributions of the R best of those M. So I would say here that R best of M in the offspring used as new parents, which will be used to seed the distribution of the next set of offspring. The alternative way that you can set up an evolution strategy is R plus M, where basically the parents now compete with the offspring. So with R plus M, we're saying that there's competition, so that like here you have M offspring, you choose the R best, but of the new offspring. So you're actually discarding the old parents. So you've got the old parents from the previous generation, use them to generate M new offspring. And then of those M new offspring, there's a new set of R best. In R plus M, then you generate M new offspring, and then you choose new parents based on the sum of those. And so here you combine parents and offspring and compete for the R new parents. So there's some ability for elitism to factor into here, because if you've got one that's continually the best, it will stick around. Whereas there's a lot of opportunity for drift here, where if you've got one that's the best and it produces a lot of offspring similar to it, but not quite it, if the best strategy here doesn't, well, so then it's not even in the pool, because now you're only looking at the offspring to choose the next parents. So those are two ways to set up an evolution strategy. Mhm. Right. So we have this generation had M individuals, and I chose the top R of those individuals and generated a new M individuals. And then so now I've got this temporary pool of my R parents and my M offspring. And then I look at that big pool, and then I select a new set of R individuals to be the source material for the next M individuals. And so maybe it'll help. I'll give concrete examples here. So examples. So a 1+1 evolution strategy. So this is going to be that the parent mutates to create the child. So in some ways, this is a little bit like a local search. The parent changes a few of its variables, so then it creates an offspring, which is a little bit different than it, has slightly different genes, slightly different alleles. And then the best of the two becomes the new parent. And then that new parent will then be the one that gets mutated. It will generate another child. If that child is better than it, then it will be the new parent. Otherwise, we stick with the old parent, mutated a different way, and so on and so forth. So that's a 1+1. Alternatively, if we did a 1 comma M, then here we're saying that there's M mutants produced from one parent. And then to figure out who the next parent is, you only look at those new mutants. You don't look at the old parent. So you say parent is then discarded, and the new parent is best of M mutant offspring. So when you see evolution strategies written down, this is a way they often summarize. And the reason they're so big into summarizing with this is that, as we're going to see, evolution strategies have this nice feature that they can be largely parameter free. Even the size of the population is not something that you necessarily have to specify. There are evolution strategies where that can be dynamic too. But whereas there's a whole bunch of hyperparameters in the genetic algorithm, then an evolution strategy will often try to adapt as it's going along and figure out the best way to go for your particular optimization function. So a lot of times, and they often will be robust to initial conditions. So a lot of times you can just list an evolution strategy in terms of these parameters, and that's all you need to know. You don't have to list this giant multi-tuple of information like you do when you parameterize the GA. All right, so questions about this notation? Okay. So I'm not going to go into great detail into evolution strategies, but I do want to at least get us to the point where we can talk about CMA-ES, or covariance matrix adaptation evolution strategy, which is a popular modern day evolution strategy that is relatively fast and easy to set up and easy to use for a lot of optimization functions, particularly if they don't have a lot of alternate solutions. Like if you're just looking for that one, or one fitness peak among a couple, then it's fast, it's cheap, and it's very effective. So of the evolution strategies, there became a group. So evolution strategies in general, again, I just want to emphasize that they allow the mutation rates to be multidimensional, potentially part of the chromosomes. But in general, they view as not taking uniform steps around the fitness landscape, that some step directions are going to be stronger than others. This feels a lot like gradient descent or gradient ascent. But if only you had a way to sort of measure the gradient. Now, in machine learning and statistics in general, there is a notion of something called the natural gradient. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but this comes from the field of kind of information geometry, and applications in statistics are come from folks like Fisher and so on. And what the natural gradient does, or especially at least when we view it through the perspective of information geometry, is it gives us a way to establish step directions which make it more likely that we're stepping toward more profitable solutions. So this natural gradient, you can think of this as the direction, at least in our context, the direction that maximizes the likelihood, or I'm going to say likelihood, of producing new solutions that are better or as good as best previous solutions. So without going into too much detail, that the general idea is, if we think statistically about what's going on in an evolutionary strategy, you've got a bunch of individuals that are just scattershot around the decision space. And a set of them are a lot better than others. So then you look at that set and you say, that set that's better than others, it tells me something about the fitness function. And I am going to use that information to create a model of the fitness objective behind the scenes. And I am then going to use that model to suggest where better solutions might be. And as I move around, I'm going to continually update that model so that my model becomes more predictable. And as it becomes more predictable, it generates better and better solutions. And we get this feedback that goes back and forth. And this natural gradient is a statistical tool that allows us to take samples and establish a step direction that works almost identical to a gradient that you'd get in like stochastic gradient descent, where in that case you have gradient information, and you might even have a way to normalize that gradient, like curvature information. So like when you've got gradient information, you not only know the step direction, but you also kind of know how steep it is, so that you know that sometimes you take large steps in that direction and other times you take short steps in that direction. This natural gradient applied in the statistical sense, even though we don't have access to a gradient, it uses our successes to establish a direction that is likely to produce more successes, more, better solutions, and a curvature where it'll say that it's really sensitive in this direction. So you have to make small steps in that direction. And it's really, insensitive in this direction. So we can make giant steps and get huge progress in that direction. And that creates this kind of mutation bowl where you've got, less mutation here and more mutation there, and that's what guides this. And so that's where this goes into it. So, I don't want to go into too many details here, but I bring this term up because this use of the natural gradient combined with evolution strategies created this whole set of so-called natural evolution strategies. Or NES. And they basically are using the natural gradient to define how to mutate their individuals. So uses, I will say, statistical measures to update mutation directions. And I'll make this more concrete with the CMA-ES that I'm about to explain here. I'll leave this up here for just a second. So there are a bunch of different ways to do natural evolution strategies. One of the most popular ones is, like I said, covariance matrix adaptation evolution strategies. So that is, so I'll say covariance matrix adaptation evolution strategy, otherwise known as CMA-ES. And I'm not going to go into all of the precise update rules here because I just want you to capture the basic idea, because the concept is far more important than all of the details about how to actually do the updates. And if you start with all the updates, it's going to be really hard to see the concept. So this is a R, M evolution strategy. So that means that we are going to have a population of M individuals, and we are going to progressively select the R best of them to help set up our step directions for the next generation. And so I'm going to write that as M samples from a distribution which is shaped by R best. And this distribution is an approximation of the fitness objective that improves over time. And for CMA-ES, it makes the assumption that the distribution that we're sampling from is a multivariate normal distribution. So what that means is that my population, so at generation K, I've got individuals X1, X2, all the way up through my XM. So this is my population. And I'm just going to sample them every generation. I just sample a whole new set of them. I don't bring any from the previous generation. I sample them from a multivariate normal, so a normal distribution, which is centered around a mean, which I'll describe here in just a second. with some covariance matrix, which for as a review, in a multivariate normal, so in a normal distribution, you've got a mean and a variance. Once you have a joint normal distribution, so you've got multiple normal distributions that potentially have interaction effects. So you've got multiple variables that might be correlated with each other. Then you summarize that with a matrix. And this matrix, this covariance matrix, which I'll just write there. This covariance matrix is going to have the variances. So this will be like down the diagonal, and it's going to have effectively the cross covariances or the correlations, a scaled version of the correlations between variables in the off diagonals. So in complex evolution strategies with lots and lots and lots and lots of variables, a lot of times they'll just make this a diagonal matrix. They'll forget about the correlations between directions. But this is, it's just basically a normal distribution where you've got a vector of means and a vector, effectively a vector of variances, and then potential for all of these directions to interact with each other. So there could be, and whenever I move in this direction, I move a little bit in that direction too. And so there's a covariance between these two directions, and that's what's captured in the off diagonals of a so-called covariance matrix. So these two quantities end up getting updated each time. So the act of drawing new individuals from this normal distribution is effectively an act of mutation. So that's how we generate new variation. Now, how do we update these parameters? Well, this mu k, which I guess I can put a little vector over if that's helpful. This mu k here is modified at each step. So modified at each step, at each generation, to be a weighted sum of best R individuals from previous generation. And this basically is sex. This is recombination. So, and then we still have to talk about how we update the covariance matrix, but the idea here is that you scattershot a bunch of individuals all over the fitness space and you score them all. And then you rank them, and then you take the R top of those here, and you then you've got a vector of weights that you can assign based on their ranking. So maybe 75% the one that is the best, and then so on and so forth. And how that vector is chosen is beyond the scope of what I want to talk about here, but just a vector of weights that is assigned to those parents. Those then generate a new mean of this distribution, which is the centroid, basically, the weighted centroid, the weighted average of the best parents in this distribution. So if right now, if in my previous generation, the normal distribution was centered here in my decision space, and so then I scattershot offspring out all over, but those offspring are really low fitness. They're really bad solutions. They're the three-wheel and one-wing robots that just don't move at all. But these ones are doing pretty well. Then I take those top R ones, and my new distribution is going to be centered. If they're equally weighted, it'll be centered on them. But if I want to say that like the top one might have a little higher weighting, then maybe it'll be biased a little bit towards the one that's really good. But that moves this distribution over so that in the next generation, my offspring will be more over here. So that's the first step, so to speak. So before I get to covariance, are there any questions about this so far? So this is it's a far less literal way to do this evolutionary approach. It's just trying to capture statistically what's going on from generation to generation. And so that's where the recombination comes into play. It's moving the mean around. All right, now the covariance step. So again, I'm not going to write out the implementation for how this is done, but CK is updated to maximize, I'll write this down, it's going to maximize the likelihood that the distribution could produce the previously favorable steps that have been seen before. So from in the previous generation, there was a certain evolutionary pathway that you walked through. And it said that I went from a candidate solution here and I stepped to a candidate solution here and I got a huge increase in fitness. So it captures kind of a gradient direction there. And so what we're going to do is update this covariance matrix to reshape it so that if that was a good direction to walk in, it would be very likely that this shaped cigar, this shaped multivariate normal distribution, would likely produce that step. So this is where we're going to capture that kind of gradient and curvature information. So this is updated to maximize the likelihood of previously favorable step directions. And so this reshapes distribution of points, of new points. And that's basically it. That's how CMA-ES roughly works. How they've done this is complex. There's a lot of other variables involved to do the bookkeeping to keep track of what these previously favorable directions were. If you want to read about that, again, it's a very popular algorithm. I'm not going to question you on that, but I do want you to take away from this the general idea of what CMA-ES is doing. This idea that it's viewing that your population is being sampled from a distribution which over time, so what happens with this is if you have a space like, if I were to draw it in 1D, which will not do it justice, so I'll try to draw it in 2D as well, though that always scares me to do that. If I have an optimization objective that, let's say I'm trying to maximize, what CMA-ES will do is it might start out with a bunch of points initially kind of everywhere. But then over time, use a different color, then these points should cluster at the highest spots of the optimization objective, or lowest if you're minimizing, and the normal distribution that will end up getting kind of approximated here, like I'll end up getting a normal distribution of points. So this here, this will be like a normal distribution, which is centered at the optimum X star that has a variance which is roughly, related to this. So this is like a normal model of fitness peak in the objective. So CMA-ES attempts to converge on the best statistical model of the fitness objective. And its population are just samples from that. So then you're going to get variation around that. But if it's a really tight point, then most of your points are going to be up at the top. If it's really fat, then you're going to get distributions kind of spread out, and so you get a lot of diversity, but they'll be very close in fitness. So that's what it's trying to do here, is instead of keeping track of kind of every individual, it's actually kind of building a statistical model and then sampling from that model, and you're getting the sampling distribution out for that model. So if I were to try to draw this in 2D, which I sort of hesitate to even attempt, but in my head, what I picture is something like you've got your multiple dimensions. So you've got maybe your x1 dimension and your x2 dimension, and your actual fitness objective has got these level sets. So it's like maybe got a peak here, and then it declines over time around it. Maybe it's got a little side peak over here. And so the CMA-ES is going to try to fit a normal distribution kind of on top of this thing. So it ends up being a multivariate normal that is centered on the X star that has a variance that is a good fit to this peak. And that's, again, summarizing what you get kind of out of CMA-ES. And so you can imagine extensions of this where, depending on how fat this is, that you might crank up the population size, because maybe you want to scatter it over more of this peak. And then depending on how tight things get, then maybe you reduce the population size, because you don't need to be resampling, because everybody looks so similar to each other, then you really only need a couple in order to explore that tiny peak. So, but for this simple version, let's imagine the population size is fixed. So any questions about that? CMA, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, you select the you select the parents before you do the weighting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the covariance is what determines how fat the sampling distribution is and what shape it is. And so the covariance is formed. So if you've had previous solutions that started out, we had a solution over here, and then we had a solution here, and that was a large increase in fitness. And so, whereas you had maybe other options where you had a solution here, and this was a decline in fitness. This one did not change fitness much whatsoever. So you look at all of these directions, and you then create an updated covariance matrix, which captures this shape. So it might be longer in this direction. It won't. It'll be shrunk in this direction, and it won't change much in this direction. And so over time, this sort of keeps a record of which directions have been most productive in this region of the decision space to move in. And then it tries to then continue making those steps. So that's why it's kind of like a gradient follower, in that it creates a model that is predicting where the next best step will be, using the success from the previous steps and failures from the previous steps. What part does the mu is moving that around? So you can think of the step directions changing the shape of the distribution, but the location of the distribution is moved into a new spot, which is where those top parents are. So if you have a bunch of candidates, some out here, and then some over here, these are better parents than these. So the mu is going to be a weighted combination of these, which might put the next the next one right here. That'll be the center of the next distribution. So you kind of ignore these when updating that location. Other questions? Uh-huh. It would be um, I mean, I think typically we think about so theoretically, I think you probably could set up a um, I'm not going to go there. Yes, I would say that we're going to think that there's a mutation direction that corresponds to each decision variable. And so the covariance is just going to be decision variable cross decision variable. You could imagine, though, kind of a PCA approach. Like there theoretically, you don't have to mutate. Like if you have a million decision variables, theoretically you could kind of do a like a principal component analysis and figure out that most of my variation is actually in this, and that direction, these three decision variables. And so I'm actually going to adapt along three, like I'm going to build a model of my space that really only sends me off in those three directions. So you absolutely could do that. For simplicity, let's just not imagine that optimization for the moment. So any other questions? That's all I want to say about ES before we move on to evolutionary programming. Okay, great. So yeah, definitely want to know CMA-ES. It is a well-used approach for this. All right, so the last kind of step of evolutionary computing, or the last section of evolutionary computing, is evolutionary programming. And genetic programming. And we'll probably pick up with genetic programming at the top of the next one. But evolutionary programming is similar to GA, and in some ways similar to ES, but it's not real valued. But, and this is important, no crossover. Genetic programming adds crossover back. Evolutionary programming does not. So, and that's important that there's no crossover. This is analogous then to interspecies competition for niches, basically. So we're not going to have sharing of genes. We're just going to have competition. Who's better than who, and that's who gets to reproduce. So what does that give us? So the the nice thing about that is that we do not have to come up. So no need for a string encoding of the decision space or of decision variables because no crossover. So we don't ever have to line them up next to each other. So it allows for evolving populations of more complex structures so long as you have a mutation operator. So what I mean by that is, for example, the early examples were finite state machines, which I'll review here in a second, for basically natural language processing for symbol prediction. So basically NLP. So the idea here is that these were FSMs, which again, I'll review here in a second, but imagine that you have an input, which is a sequence of symbols, words, if you will, um, from the environment. And you would like to output then the uh, prediction of next symbol. So good old fashioned before ChatGPT, what's the next word I'm going to type in my Google search? And then your fitness is your accuracy of prediction. So you basically feed in a corpus of text and it's got a bunch of words. This is a sentence. You feed it, this is a, and then it predicts, what comes after the a, given that the a was preceded by this is. And so that's, you want to train that thing to do well. And so the thought here was you could build a finite state machine to do this. And a finite state machine is a combination of states, transitions, and outputs. So you might say that your machine is in state A, and let's say that in state A, it could produce some output A, and it might, let's say it initially starts in state A, so I'll create a little symbol about that. And then based on the inputs from the environment, it could then transition to some state B, which might itself produce some output B. And the there in order to move it from A to B, there's some input we define as being if you receive that input while you're in state A, it brings you to state B. And then likewise, while you're in state B, we can define certain inputs that when you're in state B will bring you to state A, and then we can have self loops. So there's certain inputs that when you're in B will bring you back to B, and certain inputs that when you're in A will bring you back to A. And we can also associate outputs with those inputs that are a little bit more immediate. So if you were in state A and you're on your way to state B and you received that input, then there's also an opportunity to put an output here. So these are different ways that we can create variable finite state machines. And so just as a matter of terminology, it doesn't matter too much, but when your outputs depend on state, we call that a Moore machine. And when your outputs depend on edges or transitions, then we call that a Mealy machine. And every single computer program can be written as a finite state machine. This is just all of computation can be written in terms of this. You've given enough states, enough transitions, and so on. So what the evolutionary programming folks did is they said, well, great. What if I just learn to evolve finite state machines to solve that prediction task? So it generates a population of random FSMs. And you can imagine just an FSM with a single state and a single state that is the initial state with a single output. And then it defined mutation operators for each one of those FSMs. So FSM mutations. So given an individual in a population, we can, for example, change an output signal symbol. We can change a state transition. So we can pick a random state transition already in the machine and we can blow it away or we can add a new one. So there's no transition from A to C. So I'm just going to add a transition from A to C. We can add a state. So if I start with one state, I could get more and more. We can delete states and their transitions. We can change the initial state. And I think that's pretty much it. I think that's a pretty complete set. So the idea here, and then you can also do more than one mutation at a time. And so you can, with all of that, you generate a population of random FSMs. You evaluate how good they are at prediction. So you run through them a bunch of words. This is a blank. What do you predict? How often do you get it right? Over and over and over again. And then you end up getting rid of the poor scoring ones and allow good performers to mutate and produce new children. And so then that gives you the ability to evolve programs effectively. So programs have inputs and outputs. This doesn't have to be just for NLP. This shows you at least a first attempt at having computers write software using an evolutionary approach to guide them. So I'm happy to take questions of that after class here, but what we're going to do next time then is to close with genetic programming, which finds a way to do this in actual code, not with the FSMs, where you actually could get a population of code that you can read, looks like C code or Python or whatever, and offspring that looks like new lines of code, and you can score each one of those. You can even recombine them. So we can actually have two pieces of code have sex and produce two offspring that are mixtures of those two. We can't do it quite with FSMs, but we can do it with abstract syntax trees, basically, is where we're going to go with that. All right, so that's all I got for you today. We'll see you with genetic programming, and then we'll do artificial immune systems after that.